The Week in Art is sponsored by Christie's. Visit christies.com to find out more about the world's leading auction house since 1766. Auction, private sales, online, art, anytime. Hello, it's The Week in Art. I'm Ben Luke. This week, Ukraine, the contemporary art scene and the ethics of photojournalism in war. Plus, Chris Burden's unrealised projects and FN Souza's self-portrait as Saint Sebastian. Following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, I talked to Svitlana Biedarieva, a Ukrainian art historian, artist and curator, about the community of artists in her home country and how they're responding to war. Also on Ukraine, Tom Seymour talks to the photographer Mark Neville, who's been based in the Ukrainian capital Kyiv for the past 18 months and left the city last week, about a photojournalistic series he made in Ukraine, about ethical approaches to reportage and about the effects of documenting war-torn countries. Also this week, as a book is published featuring Chris Burden's unrealised projects, I talked to Jori Finkel about the American performance and installation artist's extraordinary imagination. And in this week's Work of the Week, Jane Alison, curator of the Barbican Art Gallery in London's new exhibition Postwar Modern, discusses one of the key works in the exhibition, FN Souza's Mr. Sebastian. A reminder that to keep up with all the Art Newspaper's latest stories, you can download our app for iOS and Android, which you can find in the App Store or Google Play. And do subscribe to this podcast wherever you're listening and to our sister podcast, A Brush With, and give us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts. It helps others to find us. Now, it's more than a week since the Russian President Vladimir Putin ordered the invasion of Ukraine. But what does this mean for the community of artists in the country? In recent years, much contemporary art from Ukraine has been marked by the Maidan Revolution or Revolution of Dignity in 2014, Russia's annexation of Crimea later that year, and the war that has raged in the Donbass region in eastern Ukraine ever since. Svitlana Biedarieva is an art historian, artist and curator who co-organised the exhibition At the Front Line, Ukrainian Art 2013 to 2019, shown in Mexico in 2019 and Canada in 2020. Based in Mexico City, Svetlana is also the author of a recent book on contemporary Ukrainian and Baltic art. I spoke to her about the artist community in her home country, the work they've made in recent years, and how they're responding as Russian forces attack. Svitlana, thank you very much for joining us on the podcast. I wanted to begin by asking you, have you heard from artists who are currently in Ukraine over the past week?
Yes, I'm in contact with many of the artists who are now in Ukraine, and now they have a really difficult situation, many of them. Some of the artists, they managed to leave the hot places like Kyiv and Kharkiv and to move towards Western Ukraine or towards Polish border, but many of them, they stay inside Kyiv and Kharkiv, and that's not only because of impossibility to go out, because there is such a possibility, but many of them, they have quite strong civil positions that they need to stay and help in any way, in the way of volunteering, in the way of defending or even documenting of all these traumatic events and kind of performing their duty as artists, but also as documentary practitioners.
Okay, and let's talk about that documentary practitioner aspect, because the fact is that you've written extensively about this, that documentary has actually become a particularly notable form in Ukraine recently in terms of artists, almost as a response to the conditions of war which have existed in Ukraine over the past decade or so.
Yes, I have written several texts on this topic, and the idea is that Ukraine, after 2013 and the protests in the Maidan, then the annexation of Crimea, and then the beginning of the war with Russia, experienced very strong necessity to document the ongoing events. And artists took this responsibility, and that's how occurred the documentary turn in Ukrainian art. So we can speak about photography, we can speak about short films, which are on the border between cinema and contemporary art. We can speak about media art, and we can speak about even new genres, like, for example, reportage art that appears with the beginning of the violent events in the east of Ukraine.
Can you say more about the kinds of work? Because, as you say, there's a very, very broad range there. But, I mean, how straightforwardly documentary are they? What kind of subjects do people deal with? What kind of subjects are the artists approaching?
For example, if we speak about the work of Ukrainian filmmaker Piotr Armenovsky, he comes from Donbass. He needed to leave Donbass in 2014 because he was active there in the organization of democratic elections, and so he was blacklisted by all these pro-Russian groups who entered in an occupied part of the Donetsk region. And he continued working from outside the area, but approaching to the area from the side of Ukrainian territory. And he was filming the consequences and the very process and the consequences of military actions in those towns near the demarcation line. And his work became very important precisely for this kind of combination of documentary approach and very personal approach, because he's attached to this area and he knows people from this area, and these people, they tell their own and personal stories. And another example is the work by Evgenia Belarusets, who is a photographer and a writer. She traveled to the borderline with the occupied territories to small minor towns, and she was documenting lives there. And the routine that was overshadowed by these war conditions, and generally the economic and cultural conditions in which these people live, which are not very good conditions, and with a big focus on the life of women, female minors. In these projects, documentary becomes a background for something more, for a story that has to be told, and this story is not a story of one person, but of group of people who are finding themselves in certain difficult situation. So this is the trend that I would say Ukrainian documentary art is following now. And for example, now I know that Evgenia Belarusets is in Kyiv, and she is trying to document the ongoing aggression of the war and the ongoing events. I still don't know what kind of project is going to be, because of course now it's very difficult to publish anything like that, like to document the destructions, for example, in the city is not good from the point of view of military defense. So these projects keep on going, as well as, for example, Alevtina Kahidze, who documented the life of her mother in the Donbass. Her mother needed to stay there for all the time while this territory was occupied. Alevtina couldn't visit her, and the worst part of the story is that her mother needed to travel to receive her pension from the Ukrainian government to cross the demarcation line every month. And in one of these times, she died because of this enormous queues and enormous bureaucratic, chaotic procedure that were needed to cross the border. So now Alevtina also is working on several graphic projects that reflect on the current state of war and already the bombs and shellings that occur just next to her house. And her house is near Kyiv.
That's extraordinary. So one of the factors that you've clearly identified then is that the impulse towards documentary, which emerged in the revolution of 2013 to 14, continues today, and they're seeing themselves as essential in terms of reporting on current events. It's not just about reflecting the wider culture, but reflecting events as they happen. It seems extraordinarily courageous that they're doing that. Yes,
I agree with you. And it is important that artists, even if they had to leave their home places sometimes, even if they're displaced, that they have this privilege to voice the opinion of the society and to represent the life of the society. And this is one of their kind of big responsibilities that they can perform precisely right now.
One of the things that you've also stressed is that as well as bringing Ukrainian art to wider attention, they're also bringing Ukrainian national identity to wider attention, and that means the complexity of Ukrainian national identity. Can you say more about that?
I believe that Ukrainian identity is very multifaceted, is something that cannot be just described by means of language or by means belonging to certain tradition. Because, of course, many of Ukrainians, they are Russian speakers, many of Ukrainians, they are Ukrainian speakers, but they're still Ukrainian. And that doesn't have anything to do with these claims of Russia that they were going to save Russian speakers in Ukraine. No, I'm a Russian speaker, and no one needs to save me from my country. But I think that this war is something where this identity is being crystallized and is being visible and seen. That it's based not on formal characteristics, but rather is based on common values. And these values are core values of peace, of democracy, of freedom of speech, for example. And this is what actually envelopes and characterizes Ukrainian identity now.
I was intrigued by something that you wrote in the essay for the exhibition that you curated in Mexico City, where you're talking to us from now, called At the Front Line. In that essay that you said that the artistic community was united, and you say, and I'll read it, artists who were once divided into right and left camps became united in their resistance to external aggression. Can you say more about that?
Artists from different camps and different points of view and perspectives, they try to help in some way to the society to which they belong, and also to work with the topics in a way creating critique from different points of view. And that's what we were trying to show in the exhibition in Mexico, that there is no one single perspective. There are different perspectives. And these perspectives might take a different kind of political point of views, internal political point of views. That's certain points of history, like the history of Ukraine is incredibly difficult, is very traumatic, and is very complex. And it can be different attitudes to these precise moments in this history. But this doesn't affect our desire to construct something new in the moment that we are living now. And in this way, yes, I can say that artists, they're kind of united in the Ukrainian society. I've discussed this with colleagues at the Association of Eastern European Studies in November at the conference, and which is actually the opposition and which is actually right and left in Ukraine, and kind of everything is so messed up. And the answer of one of my colleagues was very interesting, that actually we have active right and active left politically, and also if you speak about art activism. And we have completely inert center, people who are belonging to this idea that they cannot change anything. So basically the tension inside Ukraine is where left and right are united in a way, because they have active positions. I don't know how relevant is to artistic field. I think, yes, it is true. But political position, especially in such crisis of war as now, doesn't mean much. Everybody wants to defend their country.
And also, of course, in that show and in your writings generally, you've pointed to the fact that there are artists across Ukraine. Yes, Kyiv is an inevitable centre, but there are artists that you have worked with who are in different cities like Kyiv, for instance. Can you say how diverse is the artistic community across the country?
I was really impressed about how the art from the East appeared on the artistic scene in Ukraine in the last 8 years. No one knew that such brilliant and very rich scene existed in Lugansk Oblast, in Donetsk Oblast, in Crimea. But when the war started and the artists started moving from those areas to Kyiv or to Lviv or to other parts of the country, they started creating projects that are some kind of, I would say, really they define the Ukrainian cultural scene now. So art from the east of the country became the definitive for it. Also because they managed to describe the events as eyewitnesses of these events. And they got a lot of impulse for creating these new projects. I was recently interviewing 5 artists for October Journal, published by MIT Press. They have this new section of art communities at risk. and so soon it will be published. And precisely I was interviewing 5 artists who needed to change their location because their hometowns in Crimea or in Donbass were occupied and they needed to leave. From the conversations with them, I understood that actually the kind of this transplantation, let's say, of the topics from the occupied territories into the rest of Ukraine, and then the discussion of these topics is something absolutely new that didn't exist before 2014. It's some kind of decentralization, but also is an exchange, a more intensive exchange that, of course, will, with the time, and it is already now, will produce new types of art, probably, new movements, and a wide range of new topics to discuss. Because when there is exchange, of course, there is more possibilities to create.
And of course, again, something that you've referred to, and I believe it's been called Ukrainian Renaissance, is that actually after the revolution and while the war in the east has been going on and the annexation of Crimea happened, you said that actually in 6 years since the revolution, the changes in Ukrainian art and the kind of developments and the impetus of development in Ukrainian art was more substantial than in the entire period between independence and that moment. Can you say something about that? Was it purely the sort of revolutionary impulse that triggered that, or were there other factors?
There was certainly a number of factors. One was the revolutionary impulse that triggered it, the necessity to reflect on the traumatic events of the war. But also, finally, Ukraine received its own impulse for the institutional development, because institutional development is very important in support of the art and in support of the decentralization of art. That art is not just based on Kyiv, but in all the cities. And in 2018, for example, a governmental organization called Ukrainian Cultural Foundation was created with the aim to support artistic projects of different types and of different levels, private initiatives, organizational, international collaborations in cinema, in art, in music, in cultural heritage. And this possibility was the first one since the independence of Ukraine, and even before. And this was something that pushed new initiatives emerging in different parts of Ukraine. And what is more important is that more initiatives became emerging in the demarcation line between occupied territories and Ukraine. And these projects, led by local non-governmental organizations, they aimed precisely to involve people into some activities that would help dialogue, exchange, and maybe study together or maybe create together. And this was one of the really important moments. Another important initiative that emerged after the Maidan was Ukrainian Institute that also supports projects in the countries outside Ukraine. Ukrainian projects in collaboration with different countries. And they realized several good exhibitions. They realized a wonderful exhibition about Ukrainian war in Vienna with kind of very interesting presentation of Ukrainian artists and so on. So we see that basically Renaissance appears not only from the goodwill of people and the inspiration of the artist, but also there should be an institutional support. And then the result that we can see already in the last 8 years.
And of course, one must inevitably be concerned now that those artists' very lives are under threat and those institutions are under threat themselves. We're hearing about museums, collections being hidden away. Of course, it would be impossible for many of the institutions to continue practicing. So tell me what your thoughts are now about the events right now and how that's affecting those communities that you're talking about.
It's very difficult to see what is going on in Ukraine because the information is very few. Because also there is this call from the government, from the defense forces, not to document extensively, to put it in the social networks, in order to avoid kind of new attacks. They're in this precisely tactical moments of defense. And but from what appears, it looks just horrible because they've destroyed already several historical buildings, one in Chernigov. And undoubtedly, they destroyed some historical buildings in Kyiv. We don't know which ones. They destroyed a museum in Ivankiv. which was an archaeological museum. It had a collection of Policia icons. It had a collection of Maria Primachenko works, which is a major Ukrainian naive artist. But there is a hope that actually that collection was saved of her works, but it's not clear yet. And so on. I believe every museum developed their own plan of evacuation of works, and they are either hiding them somewhere in very, very safe place that is not that easy to shell, or probably they evacuated them to some other parts, maybe to the west of Ukraine. But I must say that the way how it looks now, everybody is very worried about Ukrainian cultural heritage, because Ukraine has churches from 11th century. It has Sofia Cathedral. It has a kind of many really valuable and something unique in its own way. And now, because of the Russian aggression, all of these treasures are under threat of destruction.
And finally, do you have any message to the listeners to this podcast about what they can do to help?
There is a page called Razom for Ukraine. This is a foundation that works since 2014, and they deliver emergency help to Ukrainian citizens. And there are many smaller initiatives that accept humanitarian help in different ways. And also it is important actually to distribute the information about the war in Ukraine and kind of to avoid the distortion of it, because there is a lot of misinformation on the networks, and it's important to read correct sources and to transmit that correct information. In terms of Ukrainian art, I just want to say that art usually helps to recovery from any trauma. And art in Ukraine, I believe, will help to restore this peace eventually and to create maybe some new meanings and new identities on the basis of all this destruction, and to raise to something better. And honestly, I hope that this war will finish very soon, because it's already quite unbearable to Ukrainian society.
Well, thank you, Svetlana, for saying that and for joining us on the podcast.
Thank you very much.
The foundation that Svetlana mentioned is called Razom for Ukraine, and you can find it at razomforukraine.org. That's RAZOM for Ukraine.org. Svetlana's website is svitlanabiedarieva.com, and you can find a link in the description of this podcast. Now, distressing images emerging from Ukraine reflect the crucial role of photojournalism in bringing us the realities of war. The British photographer Mark Neville, who in the past has been nominated for the Pulitzer Prize and for the Deutsche Börse Prize, has been based full-time in Ukraine for the last 18 months, after travelling there for many years. In 2015, he began a photojournalistic series documenting life in the country, with imagery ranging from people holidaying on Odessa's beaches to soldiers on the front line in the eastern part of the country. Tom Seymour, associate editor at the art newspaper, caught up with him this week to ask about his experiences in Ukraine, about the ethics of photography in war zones, and about how he's been affected by his experiences.
Mark Neville, thanks ever so much for taking the time to speak for us today. You escaped Kyiv last week. Your home's there by Maidan Square, and you drove for 24 hours to the west of Ukraine when the bombs started to fall. Can you talk us through that experience for us?
Sure. Well, I moved from London to Kyiv in October 2020, so I'd been there for about a year and a half. When I say moved, I mean really moved. My home, my studio, everything, my possessions. And I lived in that apartment with my partner, Lukiria, a Ukrainian woman. And basically, I woke up on the morning of the 24th, on Thursday, to the sound of an explosion and sirens. And then I had a very long day trying to decide what it was that I wanted to do, that we needed to do. And then I guess around 5 o'clock, I got a report from somebody that the Russians were planning to target the presidential home, which is in central Kyiv, and it's about 50 meters away from where I live, which sounds terribly posh. It's not, but it's very close. So we left. We managed to get a lift in a van with about 4 other people. And we left about 7 o'clock on the first day of the conflict and drove for 24 hours to western Ukraine, to Lviv, where we are at the moment.
And how have you been over the last week? How has your emotional state been?
Well, I have been to war zones before. I mean, I've been to the front line here in Ukraine, actually, on a number of occasions. I've been to Donbass since 2015. And I've also spent 3 months with the British Army in Helmand, Afghanistan during their time there. So, I do have some experience of trauma and wars and so forth, but nevertheless, it's extremely exhausting. And part of the problem is that you face all these kind of moral, ethical dilemmas all the time, like who do I help? Who am I responsible for? Am I responsible for my partner? Am I responsible for these people who are now homeless? Am I responsible for picking up a gun and shooting a Russian? Where can I best put my efforts? Is it better that I leave the country and try and help people remotely? Should I fundraise? Should I donate blood? And your mind kind of goes off in 100 different directions all at once every day, trying to decide what the best thing to do is. And of course, there is no clear-cut answer to those questions. So it's extremely punishing. I wouldn't say I'm scared, but it's just about trying to make those right decisions all the time.
Ukraine, from Boris Mykolaiv onwards, and previous to, has a real proud history of photojournalism. How would you describe the photojournalistic community in Ukraine? How have they responded to this incredible crisis?
Well, one thing to say is that, there's a law now that if you're aged between the age of 18 and 60, if you're a male, you're not allowed to leave the country. So many of my friends who should have left the country have stayed, many of my photographer friends. And of course, they have no choice. So what are they doing? They're doing what I'm doing, which is working. They're picking up a camera and they're trying to document what's going on. But I know the community here. They're extremely dedicated and quite brilliant, I have to say. And one of the things I've tried to do over the past few days is draw attention to the fact that so many foreign photographic crews are coming to Ukraine now. And I'm like, why? We've got this incredible wealth of photographic talent here in Ukraine. And surely it's cheaper and safer to just do some research, pick up a phone, call one of these incredible photographers and just say, listen, can you work for, New Yorker for a week or Washington Post or Vanity Fair or whoever it is, and send us some material. And I tell you, the material will be better, not least of all because these people actually know the language, they know their country, they know the situation, and they understand it. So if I understand it correctly, news is about accurate reporting. It's about trying to find the truth. The best way to get the truth is to work with people who understand it, locals. And these people are not only brilliant photographers, they understand what's going on because they've been living with war in their own bloody country since 2014. They've had it on a daily basis, not in Kyiv, but 600 kilometers away in Donbass. So I'm lost for words that there needs to be a complete change in the way we think about reporting on conflict and reporting in general, I would say.
They call it parachute journalism. Do you think that still has a place?
Of course. I mean, there's an element of objectivity that's brought to a situation if it's not happening in your own backyard. And there's definitely a place for it, but it's totally imbalanced at the moment. And also, it's about helping people. If a war happens, the most important thing is to support people. Everything else is secondary. So why on earth are these European and American media platforms spending tens of thousands of dollars on sending people abroad when they could pay a journalist who needs the money in Ukraine, and that money will keep them alive and they'll get better material? It's completely ridiculous. It makes me furious.
Okay, so you moved to Ukraine in 2015. That was shortly after the hybrid war began, which you referenced.
Yes.
A book that you've just published, 10 days ago, Stop Tanks of Books. It's a portrait of Ukraine throughout the course of the hybrid war. Talk us about this project. I wouldn't call it conflict photography. It's social documentary, maybe.
Well, it's a strange story because I first came to Ukraine because of a project I did in Britain called Battle Against Stigma. So I'd spent 3 months with the paratroopers in Afghanistan during 2011 as a kind of official war artist sent by the Imperial War Museum, not by a newspaper, not by a gallery, but by the Imperial War Museum. So I came back from that experience in 2011 with post-traumatic stress disorder. And I recovered, but it took me a while. It was a process, and I decided I wanted something positive to come out of it. So I made this book called Battle Against Stigma to try and raise awareness about mental health issues in the British military and to encourage veterans and soldiers who were suffering with PTSD, with adjustment disorder, to come forward and seek professional help. So I made this book. It was banned by the British government. In other words, it was printed in Spain in an edition of 1,500 copies. The first consignment of 500 copies came over from Spain and was seized by UK Border Force in 2015. And I was on television talking about this seizure. I was on the radio, newspapers. And to this day, I've never seen that consignment of books. Another consignment came via a different route, and that came to my studio safely in London. And I was able to spend all summer sending it out to homeless centres, charities, mental health institutions, prisons, all the places where you end up if you develop PTSD and you don't get treated. So out of the blue, I suddenly get this email from Kyiv Military Hospital in Ukraine. I'd never been to Ukraine before, saying, "We heard about your book. Do you have a Ukrainian language version of it?" And I was like, wow, no, I don't actually. But I was so touched that my own country had tried to ban my book, whereas this post-Soviet country, in inverted commas, was so forward-thinking about the treatment of their own veterans who were coming back from Donbass with terrible psychological damage, were reaching out to me and saying, help us, I was like, wow. So I had the book, the British book, Battle Against Stigma, translated into Ukrainian, made into a PDF, and I sent it to them. And then I thought, no, I'm going to go and visit them. These people deserve a visit. So I went to Kyiv Military Hospital, and I just fell in love with the country, with the people, with the food, with the architecture, with the culture, with the history. And I saw this incredible bravery and resilience and humility that we were witnessing now on the news reports, in the defense of their own country. And then I would come back all the time, every time I had an opportunity to visit Kyiv or Ukraine again, I would take it. Whether that was for work or to do an exhibition or to do a talk about my work or whatever it was. And then I guess in about 2020, I realized, what am I doing living in London where I could be living where my heart is, But I saw this coming in 2015, and the book that I've made, which has just been published and released, has been in the pipeline since 2015. I had this idea to make a book about the war, send it out in a targeted dissemination to a targeted audience of diplomats, politicians, celebrities, and negotiators, all the people I thought could help Ukraine in its fight for independence and defeat Russian aggression. So I had the concept and a lot of the content already finished by 2016-17. And in 2018, I was ready to publish.
Difficult question, maybe. You've spent many, many years creating a book, which I imagine you thought very, very carefully about the ethics behind this portrait. For a lot of photographers that are flying into the country and a lot of photographers that are photographing war for the first time that are already based in the country, what's your advice to them when it comes to ethical photography, given how much misinformation is flying around the internet, how much propaganda is becoming a key part of this conflict and the information wars and so on? How do photographers approach this incredible challenge in the right ethical way?
Well, I think you've got to put your own safety and the safety of others at paramount importance, really. It's just using common sense, being sensitive, looking around you, being aware, and acting with respect, And also you've got to find a very good Ukrainian fixer. And you've got to really ask yourself, am I actually bringing anything to the table by flying into this war zone? It's not enough to think, it might help my career. That's not good enough. You've got to think, what am I actually bringing to the table? Am I going to bring a fresh perspective? Am I going to be able to cope? Am I going to end up actually endangering and being a burden on people around me rather than helping? So I would say mostly just taking pictures is not enough of a good reason to go to a war zone. And I would strongly argue for people not to do that, in fact. And if they can find a way to support Ukrainian photographers instead, or people living and working on the ground here in Ukraine, I would say do that. Do the right thing, do the ethical thing, because these people can get it right. Let them get it right for you. And, if you want to go and take photographs in the war zone at some point, I'm sure you probably will be able to do that. Wars will not end happening, unfortunately. But, You've got to pick and choose how best you can contribute and really examine what your own motivation is for taking photographs. Who are you really helping? What are you really trying to change through your photographs? If you just want to get your name in New York Times, please stay away. If you want to really try and change things and you're really committed to some kind of activist approach, then do it. But activism involves ethical responsibility for other people.
You mentioned you've experienced post-traumatic stress disorder in your life. A lot of photojournalists on Twitter are saying, I think I might have PTSD. We're discussing amongst ourselves whether we're experiencing PTSD. For someone that might be going through that, not just photojournalists, obviously, but citizens across Ukraine, what's your advice to them?
I would say it's perfectly normal reaction. When I was in Afghanistan, a soldier came up to me and said, you will be traumatized after this. It's impossible to readjust to civilian life, normal civilian life after this experience. And this is what worries me, is that we're going to have a whole nation, no matter if everyone survives from now on, from this minute on, there's no more casualties. Nevertheless, the whole nation is going to be traumatized. And that is not to do with inner strength. That's just a fact. That's just a fact of human nature. And that's how trauma works. So please be good to yourselves after this experience is over and recognise that you will all be traumatised.
There's quite a lot of comment in Western media basically prophesizing that Ukraine are essentially going to give up the fight and, give in to Russian aggression. What's your message to people saying that?
I would say they're completely deluded. That will never, ever happen. You can have 50 million Russian troops here. This will always remain Ukraine. I don't say that in some kind of jingoistic, chest-thumping way. It's just the case. People here are extremely resilient, extremely proud. And like I said, they're going to fight for those freedoms that we take for granted in the West. They're not going anywhere. Even with an occupying force, it's never going to work. This will never be Russia. It was Russia several hundred years ago. It isn't anymore. It's Ukraine. They have their own language, their own customs, their own sense of humour, their own food. That's not changing.
Mark Neville, thanks ever so much for your time, and please stay safe out there.
Thank you very much, Tom.
Mark Neville's Stop Tanks with Books is published by Setanta and Nazreli Press and priced £50 or $60. Tom Seymour has compiled a list of 8 verified photojournalists reporting at this moment on the ground in Ukraine, representing some of the world's most respected media organisations. You can read that and our full coverage of the Russian invasion at theartnewspaper.com or on the app. Coming up, we hear about Chris Burden's unrealised projects and FN Souza's Mr. Sebastian. But first, here are a few of the top stories beyond the Russia-Ukraine war on our website this week. At this week's auctions, new records were set for a number of artists. René Magritte's painting, The Empire of Light, hammered for £51 million or $59.4 million with fees at Sotheby's in London on Wednesday, and at Christie's in London on Tuesday. The German expressionist Franz Marc's painting, The Foxes, sold for £37 million or $42.6 million with fees. And the market for young painters continues to be explosive. A student work by Flora Yuknovich sold at Christie's for £1.5 million or $1.9 million with fees against an estimate of $250,000 to $350,000, while a work by Rachel Jones sold at Sotheby's for $490,000 or $617,000 with fees, almost 10 times its low estimate of £50,000. An unknown Claude Monet painting has surfaced at Marks & Spencer, or M&S, the British retail chain, as Martin Bailey writes. It's not for sale and has just gone on loan to a gallery at the University of Leeds in northern England. Autumn at Jeufosse from 1884 is unrecorded in the comprehensive Wildenstein catalogue raisonné of Monet's work. It's almost certainly a major rediscovery, although it's yet to be properly authenticated. M&S and the Leeds Gallery have approached the New York-based Wildenstein Plattner Institute, which authenticates Monet's work, to consider Autumn at Jeufosse. Its verdict is likely to be given later this year. And finally, archaeologists from Mexico's National Institute of Anthropology and History have interpreted the glyphs of an ancient frieze excavated in Oaxaca that offers significant insight into the cultural norms of Zapotec and Mixtec cultures. As Gabriella Angeletti reports, the limestone and stucco frieze was discovered in 2018 in the Atzompa zone of the Monte Alban archaeological region, a UNESCO World Heritage Site built in the 6th century BCE.
The glyphs primarily allude to themes related to superstition and social hierarchies, including figurines of monkeys, jaguars, and supernatural protective figures, and representations of the quincunx, a geometric design that alludes to the four directions and to the centre of the universe, and the Quetzal bird, a Mayan and Aztec symbol of nobility or wealth. You can read all these stories and much more on the website or the app. We'll be back after this. The Week in Art is sponsored by Christie's. Welcome the spring season this March at Christie's New York with 3 sequential live auctions that feature work by the defining artists of contemporary art. Dig into prints by David Hockney, Andy Warhol and Keith Haring, alongside current headliners Cecily Brown and Damien Hirst. Discover top quality works by Ed Ruscha, Jeff Koons and Felix Gonzalez Torres, and complete the series experience with a 19th century landscape by Eugenio Landesio, a newly discovered oil painting by Diego Rivera, and fine examples by Wilfredo Lam, Claudio Bravo, and more. Find out more at christies.com. Welcome back. Now, the Gagosian Gallery has just announced the publication of Poetic Practical, the first book to focus on Chris Burden's unrealised work. It features 67 projects that the Los Angeles-based artist was unable to complete before he died in 2015. I spoke to Jori Finkel, a regular contributor to the art newspaper and the New York Times, based in LA, about the book. Jori, we're going to come on to Chris Burden's unrealised projects soon, but first I think it would be good to talk about the ones that he did realise. So can we set a bit of the scene? Who is Chris Burden? What were his major works?
By the time I moved to LA in 2005, Chris Burden was already a really important established artist here and also internationally. And soon he would make a work for LACMA that is not only in front of LACMA, but really defines the museum in a way, and that is Urban Light, where he brought together this cluster of over 100 Art Deco vintage lampposts and arranged them in a certain form, rewired them, and created a really important public art installation in a city that doesn't have much public art. So that was one of the first big projects I got to see him working on. He also created Metropolis for Inside the Museum, which is his fantastic version of LA. If LA didn't have traffic and had cars whizzing through it all the time, it might look like Metropolis.
Yeah, exactly. And of course, the foundation of his work is actually not these grand installations. It came from a place of performance and these really genuinely still shocking performance pieces, right?
They were shocking and they were really intense. He didn't like them being described as stunts because I think there was an association with like Evel Knievel in the 1970s. So it was in the 1970s that he became famous for his performances, starting with a piece that he did in graduate school at UC Irvine called 5-Day Locker Piece, where he locked himself in that locker for 5 days, true to the title, with only access through a pipe or hose, access to water, and a pipe or hose to relieve himself. But it was a small locker, 2 foot by 2 foot by 3 foot. So, starting with that, and then right around that time, he also had himself shot in the left shoulder by a friend at fairly close distance, but shot with a .22 caliber rifle in the name of art. So yes, he brought this incredible intensity to his work very early on, starting with the performances.
Indeed. So the kind of unrealised projects that are the subject of this book are actually from that period after the performance. So there's this big transition that happens in his work, isn't there? Sort of mid-70s to 80s, where he shifts away from performance effectively.
Absolutely. By the early 80s, he was no longer doing performances, and there's not a single performance piece in the book of unrealised projects. So I asked the director of his estate, Yayoi Shinwari, why weren't there any performances? And she said, we couldn't find any performances in the archive. So there was no evidence that he was planning performances beyond the 1980s.
It's really interesting that, isn't it? Do you have any sort of thoughts on why he turned his back on performance in that way? I mean, he always did say that there was a performative element to some of the later work, but why did he stop making performances? Because he'd made such an impact,
My own sense is that he was developing this reputation for being a stuntman in a certain way, and that he didn't like that. He was so allergic to that. And he was always very mechanical. He was always building cars and fixing cars. So I also think that there may be a progression that we see, an evolution that we see, because as his career became more developed and his relationship with Gagosian Gallery became more developed, he actually had the means to build more. That initially, what did he have to work with as a student? His body. And that at some point he did have budgets. Maybe they weren't big enough to realize all of his projects, as we learned from this book. But he had the resources to build more, and he was always very mechanically inclined. I mean, so much so that people think of him as an engineer in artist clothing. And I think this book actually shows you why he's not, that he actually leads with the vision. And sometimes the vision doesn't even work from an engineering standpoint or technical standpoint or technological standpoint.
Just to give an example of the kind of big dreaming, if you like, that's in this book, there is this piece about the American flag, and that seems to me to sum up what you're talking about. He was searching for a kind of a material that didn't even exist, right?
Right. He had this idea for the fabric workshop, I believe, of creating an American flag sculpture, if you will, but an American flag that would burn and burn and burn without consuming itself, that the fire would always stay lit. And in order to do that, you would need a special kind of material that can burn without burning out, without extinguishing. And that material didn't exist as far as he could tell. So he had this idea, but he didn't have the chemistry to realize it.
You mentioned Metropolis earlier on. So he's really interested in infrastructures of travel and all those kind of things, right? So tell us about some of the works which relate to that idea of fundamental urban infrastructure.
One of my favorite is this pneumatic subway that he planned for Gagosian Gallery. His relationship with Larry Gagosian goes very far back. So we were talking about the performances from the 1970s. In 1976, Larry Gagosian's first show anywhere was in his Los Angeles gallery of Chris Burden's work. We know that he started as a poster dealer, right? But his first show of an artist was Larry showed Chris Burden's relics, he called them. And that is the relics from these performance pieces. And so one of the fun things that I learned in the reporting of this story is that Larry himself still owns the lock from 5 Day Locker piece, and that Jasper Johns owns the bullet from Shoot.
How amazing.
So they go back to 1976. So flash forward to the year 2010, when Larry Gagosian opens this beautiful flagship gallery that we all know on West 24th Street in Chelsea, New York. You know, the defining Chelsea gallery in a way. And my memory is that he opened with Richard Serra, which isn't an easy install. You know, that was a big show and it was not an easy install. The gallery opened in 2009, I should say. By 2010, early the next year, Chris has a proposal for Larry that involves 2 giant kinetic sculptures. I mean, think about what he was doing with the flying steamroller, trying to get a steamroller off the ground. So 2 giant kinetic sculptures. And I'd like to dig into your gallery, dig beneath the ground of this beautiful gallery, and install a pneumatic subway that would ride in circles and carry people. You get to see in this book, you get to see his sketches and his notes along with these descriptive entries that the art historians have prepared. And you see in his notes that it's intended to carry up to 20 people, but he could revise it to carry only 8. So he was going to be cooperative and collaborative in his thinking about it, but it did involve digging up the foundation of the gallery, which had just been built. And also, we learned in this book that all the electrical systems for the gallery are underneath the gallery, not in the walls, underneath the building. So this was a big ask of the gallerist who had supported him all of these years. So you get a sense not just of his intensity as an artist, but as a person, that he is testing not only the limits of physics in a way, you know, how fast can he make these cars move from Metropolis, or can he lift a steamroller in the air? But he's testing his relationships with people too. And so it was fun to ask Larry Gagosian, you know, why that didn't get made. And, you know, he basically said it wasn't feasible. It wasn't realistic.
But it's really interesting is because that's riffing on his own work too, isn't it? There's nice correspondences between the realised and unrealised project because, of course, much earlier he'd gone underground at MoCA, hadn't he?
Absolutely. And so this interest in exposing the foundations of these big institutions is important to him. And that's actually one of the really beautiful things about this book as well. In the margins for each project, there's a list of the realized and unrealized projects it's related to. Another example of a fun project is a beam drop that he had planned, I think in 2008, for Michael Ovitz's home gallery. Another really beautiful architectural space designed by Michael Maltzin. Home gallery doesn't do it justice. It's a museum, right? That he built a museum for himself up in the hills of Beverly Hills. And Chris proposed, and I believe Michael initiated, would you do something for the gallery? And Chris proposed a beam drop through the roof of this gallery. And he had done beam drops before, so we know where it comes from, that it wasn't a frivolous idea. He had done a beam drop for Chim around that time, and beam drops involved hoisting on these cranes a steel I-beam and dropping it to see what happens. But to do it in this, very private, beautiful space is another ask altogether. What's amazing there is that you get to see a little bit of the correspondence and that the conversations continued until 2013. So this wasn't just a provocation. These two men were seriously considering a beam drop.
That's really interesting, because one of the things about him, you talked about that he was resistant to being seen as not serious in some way, that as being a showman or being a prankster or anything like that. I mean, we're talking about this. I realised I'm smiling because it's such a kind of outlandish idea, but it was the seriousness of Chris Burden's approach that really sort of accompanied all these ideas, didn't it? He was completely deadly serious about doing them.
I think so. I was even, one of the things I was looking for in the book was a sense of humor. And I don't know that I really found it. The only example that comes close for me is that he had this idea of sending a hamster sailing across the Pacific from some point on the coast to Japan, I think, in its own boat, in its own sailboat designed for the hamster. And that the hamster would be at the helm, holding course, tacking when needed. And you're like, what is this all about? And it's to me, it seems like such a goofy idea that maybe that was like a softer moment, that he knew it wouldn't be possible. But even that, he seemed to take it very seriously or literally, that yes, he was intense and serious and all in.
Now tell me, obviously this is, again, we're talking about unrealised projects. They have the blueprints, they have the kind of ideas. Are any of these projects likely to be built after the fact? Because there are lots of, like, for instance, Jean-Claude and Christo's foundation says they're not going to build any more of the unrealised projects. That's it. What's the Burden Foundation, the Burden Estate saying?
I asked everybody I talked to this question. So there are 67 unrealized projects in the book. You would think maybe 4 or 5 of them will come out of the estate in Gagosian in the next 10 or 20 years. They did not say no. They did not say never, but they said they have no plans right now, that there's nothing they're working on from this book. What they are working on, though, is completing a project that had been in progress in his lifetime that he had actually made for the Tate, I think in 1999.
I remember it well. I wanted to talk about this project. So I was there. In my pre-journalism days, I was at the Tate. And I was there every day walking past this extraordinary contraption. So tell us about this work. It's called When Robots Rule, the 2-Minute Airplane Factory.
Right. So if you grew up like me with kind of analog toys, you might remember these little toy airplane kits made out of balsa wood, and there's a rubber band to power the plane so that they can actually fly. And Chris must have grown up with them and loved them and probably collected them. He collected so many things like that. And he had the idea that instead of assembling them yourself by hand, he would make a factory, this 2-minute airplane factory, to assemble them for you. And that ideally by the end, the factory would shoot this airplane into the air. My understanding, and you have to tell me, is that when it was shown at the Tate, it was not functioning at all. And it got pretty good reviews, which is crazy. What did you think of it?
So basically what happened was, there was this guy, this engineer, who was in the space every day with this amazing contraption. There were cables everywhere. It was extremely high tech. And then there was this kind of conveyor belt runway thing. And then, every day you'd go down into that space and you say, how are you doing? How's it going? The curators obviously were just going down every day, checking on how it was going. And always there was this, maybe we might have a flight tomorrow, but never, not one single plane flew. So for months, this contraption was in the Duveen galleries at the Tate Gallery before it became Tate Britain, before Tate Modern opened. So yeah, it was a sort of one of the last international modern art projects at Tate Gallery as it was. But yeah, never flew, never happened. But that's sort of part of the radicalism of Burden, isn't it? He wanted to test institutions effectively.
Yeah, I mean, and in that case, I think he actually wanted it to work, wanted to get this contraption moving and working. And the director of his estate said that the major problem at the time was lack of open code, lack of software available to program it. And that now that we have so much more code available, open source, that it's much more feasible to do. So they're working on that. They've been working on that for a number of years. It's not in the book because it was realized in some form, but it's something that I was able to ask about. And so the estate has been working with the gallery, with Gagosian, and Larry Gagosian told me that they don't have an exact timeline, but he's really hopeful that these little planes will be flying by the end of the year. He would like to show it at the Marciano Foundation space in LA, which he has been using for special projects.
How interesting. What's your conclusion from reading this about Burden, the artist? Do you have a different take on him now that you've read about the unrealised projects as opposed to what you know of what exists?
The art historian who co-edited the book had a really nice take on it, that she said basically she thinks that we have more direct access through this book and through these unrealised projects to his imagination. And you just feel closer to him, knowing what he was thinking about. I think what surprised me were the number of projects he went back to throughout his career, that he was remarkably consistent in his interests in transportation, in energy, in systems. And so there are some projects that he's gone back to every 5 years in a different form. And, I see that with other artists who are ahead of their time in terms of the technology. An artist like Lynn Hirschman, who was trying to build AI. She did a version of Siri before Siri. Every 2 or 3 years, she would try a different iteration until the technology caught up to her. And so it's interesting to see that for all that he was able to build, Chris Burden was also pushing at the edge of what could be built safely, and could be built with the technology of the time.
Jori, thank you so much for telling us about this book.
Thank you, Ben.
Poetic Practical, the unrealised work of Chris Burden, is published by Gagosian and priced $120. And finally, it's time for Work of the Week. The Barbican Art Gallery in London this week opened Postwar Modern, New Art in Britain 1945 to 65. And among the show's key artists is Francis Newton Souza, the artist born in Goa in India in 1924, who lived and worked in London between 1949 and 1964 before moving to New York. Among Souza's paintings in the show is Mr. Sebastian, made in 1955. And Jane Alison, the curator of the exhibition, told me about the painting. Jane, in your essay in the catalogue for Postwar Modern, you say that F.N. Souza is one of the artists who most embodies a post-war attitude. What do you mean by that?
I mean, his work is full of sort of passion, it's visceral, it's angry, it's a search for meaning, it's vulnerable. I talk about an off-kilterness in the kind of work. There's a power, there's a fragility. But yeah, this kind of a seriousness, but the works are filled with rage and but also feeling. Complex artist, much acclaimed in the period, and has been largely forgotten or perhaps being rediscovered now. But the works in the show, we have 3 incredible works. His Mr. Sebastian from 1955 was part of a sellout show in 1955. At Victor Musgrove's Gallery 1. And it's just extraordinarily powerful. I mean, it just stands up against any other work in the show. We borrowed it from India. So it's essentially a self-portrait. It's got all the hallmarks of, suffering and resilience, which come through in the work. I mean, so this is himself as Saint Sebastian. It's the most kind of extraordinary self-portrait that anybody is ever going to see. So he's got this kind of paddle-shaped head. He's got eyes in the top of his brow, and that's the way he painted himself all the time, and a lot of other people as well. And Stuart Hall said that this new wave of artists who came from the colonies of the Commonwealth in 1948 and afterwards were a generation who wanted to, claim modernism. They wanted to come to Britain and they wanted to conquer it. And, Souza exemplifies all of that. So he talked about, eyes in the brow, the better to see with the brain. So that's a kind of, hypervigilance, a kind of wary, attitudinal, this idea of conquering. And, to some extent, this Saint Sebastian is wearing a suit like a straitjacket, and there's a wonderful connection across the space with, of course, Bacon's Men in Suits at Lone Men in Bars. But here's Souza wearing a suit and tie, poking fun at British conformity, but equally talking about his own struggle to fit in. I mean, he didn't want to conform, but the struggle for colonial subjects, as they were, who came to Britain, dealing with this sort of sense of displacement, sort of a defiant otherness, a self-designed otherness, that was an act of defiance and a sort of, here I am.
What makes him identify with Saint Sebastian so much? Because he had a complex relationship with religion more generally, didn't he?
Well, he did. He identified with the suffering, essentially, of Saint Sebastian. I mean, he was brought up in Catholic Portuguese Goa and the Jesuit school in Bombay. And, it was just, had been brought up on this rich imagery of Christian martyrdom, which, of course, he wasn't a believer. I mean, he was a communist in India, not a believer at all, but I strongly identified with the suffering of Saint Sebastian and indeed Christ. So, among his most well-known portraits were also crucifixion portraits. So, it was a kind of an alter ego.
And that's really stressed in the catalogue. There's an image of the catalogue for the show in which Mr. Sebastian was shown in your book, in your catalogue, in which it's actually a photographic self-portrait of Souza, but with collaged elements with these teeth. So his identification is really writ large in that too, isn't it?
Yeah. Another signature of this painting is like the clenched teeth. And Souza talked about, how being brought up as a Christian in colonial Goa kind of minced his words. I mean, that he was speaking in a language which was other to him. And, this difficulty in speaking, actually, he was extraordinarily articulate and poetic and, wrote a lot of, highly kind of imaginative work. But he shows himself, and this is fascinating from a psychological view, with these kind of clenched teeth, which is also a kind of anger, it's a sort of held in anger. I mused on the fact that with Bacon, you get the kind of screaming mouth, and with Souza, you get the clenched teeth. Souza said, the grinding of the teeth is not in the day of resurrection, but today. So in other words, he's talking about the angst now. So in combination, the painting is extraordinarily powerful. So he had smallpox as a child as well. So arrows in the neck like flies mean affliction. Stars in the face are the scars of smallpox. And there is across Postwar Modern this kind of collapsing of personal and universal suffering that this painting embodies, as in so many other works in the show. I mean, and I think that painting stands up incredibly well against any Bacon, for instance. And I mean, that's not to do down Bacon. I'm a massive, massive fan. It's just extraordinarily powerful.
Indeed it is. Tell me more about the scene in which Souza was part when he made this painting, because there were a number of progressive galleries that are showing the work at this time.
Yeah.
But also there is a disillusionment, which you write about in the catalogue, in terms of the British art scene and its possibilities for artists, in the sense that, that there is undeniable prejudice within the culture.
Yes. Well, I often say that art is a common ground. And these artists did mix. When I'm saying these artists, what I mean is, in answer to your question, migrant artists who came to this country with great hope and optimism and wanting to be part of a nascent modernist vanguard scene. Within the community of the art world, they were largely accepted. And Victor Musgrave in Gallery 1, this was incredibly important because he showed a lot of these artists, including Souza. And, we know, for instance, that Francis Newton Souza, was mixing with Bacon, went to the colony rooms. was a sensation at the time. It was a sellout show in 55. So he was acclaimed and he was written about, and a lot of interest in his work. But he was very aware of racism within society, which was, impossible to not see. And the struggle, as he writes about, of kind of fitting in within, I think, this broader society. And then increasingly, I guess, there was disillusionment with artists like him being, kind of sectioned off, and people not really quite knowing how to respond to the work. I mean, there were some people, obviously, that did, but this kind of exoticization of the work, or, not really accepting it as part of this modernism and international modernism, but sort of only seeing the kind of exotic strangeness in it. I guess there's an element of that. So, he wrote quite a lot about feeling, the sort of gloominess of London, austerity, how difficult it was to kind of adapt. And then, eventually he left for the States in the early 60s.
I wanted to ask you also about the common ground that many artists had in that time in terms of their response to Picasso, because Souza was completely obsessed with Picasso, right?
Yes, he was. You can see that in the work. And it's interesting to think that also Francis Bacon was equally, Picasso was the figure to look at for that kind of inventive, anarchic figuration that you get. But what is interesting, I guess, in relation to Souza's work, and indeed Bacon's, is the interest in monochrome abstraction. I mean, so, I'm thinking now particularly of Souza, like he was a big fan of Yves Klein. And so that interest in the monochrome and this fusing of figuration and abstraction that you get in Souza's work in some cases, like in 65, he did this whole exhibition of entirely black paintings that are also figurative. And you get that to some extent in Bacon too. I mean, I don't want to make this all about Bacon and Souza together because but that sort of fusion, in other words, what I would call a sort of modernist figuration, an avant-garde figuration that David Sylvester was promoting as well at that time.
Absolutely. And you really see the kind of that balance of the kind of vigorous abstract language and that directness, that sort of almost brutal figuration in Mr. Sebastian, don't you? With the arrows particularly have that kind of brilliant kind of geometry about them.
Yes.
And also the kind of way that Souza describes his own face is this incredibly direct form. So you've got that kind of aggressive, formal power, but also an undeniable figurative power.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, formally very controlled, but also figuratively extraordinary. So yes, you're absolutely right. And this kind of flat up to the picture plane, single figure, there's not anything else going on much apart from the extraordinary painting, the composition and the figure. I mean, it's singled out. And I talk a lot, in the exhibition about the survivor body. For me, the injured survivor body, the suffering body reimagined and resilient, is the most powerful subject, symbol within the entire exhibition. I think it's everywhere. And Mr. Sebastian, for me, sort of absolutely exemplifies that.
You talk about this idea that obviously in the kind of aftermath of the horrors of the Second World War, after Hiroshima, after the Holocaust and everything else, painters are using painting as a means to survive, as a means to fundamentally respond, yes, but also as a kind of survival mechanism, right?
Absolutely. I think it was a terrain of healing. Souza said, I paint in order to exist. Auerbach said it's my form of action. Bacon talks about deepening the mystery. I mean, everywhere there's this kind of make art to survive. And I think that the artwork from this period is extraordinarily revealing, in a society where there was a kind of amnesia about what had happened and what was happening. And it's a desire to focus on, reconstruction and to sort of bury trauma. And I think it comes out in the work.
Jane, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Ben.
Postwar Modern is at the Barbican Art Gallery in London until the 26th of June. And that's all for this episode. We're on Twitter @TanAudio and on Facebook and Instagram, of course. The Week in Art is produced by Julia Michalska, Amy Dawson, Henrietta Benthel and David Clack, and David's also the editor and sound designer. Thanks also to Daniela Hathaway and to this week's guests, Svitlana, Tom and Mark, Jori and Jay. And thank you for joining us. See you next week. Bye for now. The Week in Art is sponsored by Christie's. Visit christies.com to find out more about the world's leading auction house since 1766. Auction, private sales, online, art, anytime.